Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Political Competitive Europe Summit. In the previous session, we talked about EU-US relations. So in the next 45 minutes, we're going to explore EU-China relations. So welcome back to our summit. And the next session is Spotlight China Direct, EU-China Dream Strategy. What does the future hold? Late last year, everyone remembers the European Commission reached an agreement in principle with China, the Comprehensive Agreement on Investment. Some see it as an important milestone for EU-China relations. Others see it as the subject of significant scrutiny, if not concern, among policymakers in Europe and elsewhere. With us today, we're very privileged to have three distinguished guests joining us. Mr. Reinhard Bütikofer, member of the European Parliament, who also chairs the delegation for relations with China. Mr. Julio Winkler, also member of the European Parliament, who is vice chair of the International Trade Committee, where he is also the rapporteur for China relations. And we also have Dr. Yu Jie joining us from London. She's senior research fellow on China with Chatham House. And my name is Stuart Lau. I'm the EU-China correspondent for Politico, and I'm anchoring the Politico China Direct newsletter, which delivers all the updated reporting and analysis on EU-China relations to your inbox every Thursday. Before we begin, just a quick reminder, do not forget to submit questions via the Swapcard app in the questions box next to the live stream. And to join the discussion by answering our poll, is the EU-China CAI, the agreement, going to be ratified? You can also tweet about this event with our hashtag political competition. So let us move to the discussion session. Why don't we begin with Mr. Winkler to get a sense of the Trade Committee's reaction on currently, the CAI has been frozen because of China's counter-sanctions on certain members of the European Parliament, including Mr. Bütikofer, of course. What is your sense on the way forward on EU-China relations now that this development has happened?
It is one of the important topics on our table, of course, the relations with China. And I think we reflect in our priorities in the International Trade Committee, and for that matter, also in the Foreign Affairs Committee, in our AFET Committee of the European Parliament. We follow the same priorities that you also have been reflected in this debate, because you began by discussing EU-US relations, and now we are discussing EU-China relations. The same happens in the International Trade Committee, and in AFET we are preparing two reports simultaneously, one report on the United States relations and another report on the future of EU-China relations. Of course, EU-China relations are much more than the comprehensive agreement on investment. And I would say the investment agreement should be one of the pillars of our approach towards China. We have also autonomous instruments of the European Union, and the good news is that the European Commission is working steadily to improve that toolbox. I would say that there is a political agreement among all the groups in the International Trade Committee that we need more and stronger tools for our trade policy, but also for our European values. Then, of course, we have the international cooperation as the third pillar. So we are not living alone with China in this world. We have very important partners. We have like-minded partners. And I'm thinking here of the United States, of course, but not only. I'm thinking also about Australia or Canada or Japan or other big players on the international trade scene. So I think that we have to reevaluate what is happening. We are very clear, and I would like to state this in my first intervention, just that to be clear. We are very clearly set about the issue that the comprehensive agreement on investment is off the table for the moment. The European Parliament and some of its members have been sanctioned by China. This is a political gesture, and we cannot accept something like this. But still, nevertheless, our China relations are very important, and we have to find the right balance between what the European Commission said in 2019, and I think that it's still valid today, that we have a multifaceted relation with China. Sometimes we are competitors, sometimes, or in certain situations, we are cooperating together, and sometimes we are rivals. Now we see that the rivalry is increasing, but of course we can never forget the other two facets of our relations. So I think it takes a lot of wisdom, a lot of patience, but also a very good political approach to find the right balance and to strike the right tones in our relationship. I hope that we in INTA can succeed such a balanced approach.
Indeed, the EU has classified the EU-China relations in three categories: partnership, and then also economic competitor and systemic rivalry. So, Mr. Bütikofer, why don't you walk us through the systemic rivalry part? I mean, we've seen the G7 statement, for example, focusing so much on an alternative to Belt and Road Initiative, for example. How do you see this systemic rivalry between the EU and China being played out in the next few months?
Thanks, first of all, Mr. Lau, for having me and including me in this prestigious panel. I would say that the rivalry plays out in two dimensions. Obviously, the internal, the domestic governance system that the leadership of China has been putting in place and has been developing towards a very centralized system of governance over the last 10 years during the tenure of Xi Jinping. That is one dimension of the systemic rivalry. China does not at all even pay lip service to human rights. China is pursuing a very oppressive policy towards national minorities, in particular the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, but also obviously in Tibet, in Inner Mongolia, against the Hui and many other national minorities. The civil society space has shrunk terribly over the recent number of years. Under the leadership of Hu Jintao, environmental or even democratic NGOs could find a certain place. That's not anymore the case. Human rights defenders have been persecuted. But there's also a second dimension to the systemic rivalry, and that pertains to the international system. China is step by step trying to build a China-centric international order that is the opposite of a multilateral system that gives every nation an equivalent right of participating in decision-making. China is not willing to accept a rules-based international order, and you see that when you look at how they construct the Belt and Road Initiative. This is not multilateralism. This is serial bilateralism. This is hub and spokes. It's Beijing-centric. And increasingly, Xi Jinping says so in public speeches, that China wants to become a hegemonic or the hegemonic power globally, and to make the world a good place for authoritarianism by using all the levers, political and economic, that China possesses, is obviously something that runs completely counter to what we stand for. So we have this systemic rivalry on both of these fronts, and interestingly, and I think that's a positive development, the new US administration has come around to sharing a European view about cooperation, competition, and rivalry. And of course, the fact that, as Mr. Winkler said, the rivalry is coming more to the fore does not mean that we are not looking for opportunities for cooperation and partnership. But as a matter of fact, that space is shrinking.
Thank you. And Dr. Yu, why don't we take a step back and look at the broader geopolitical situation facing the Chinese leadership, because of course they are celebrating the centenary of the Communist Party in just a couple of days' time. And if you look at the international situation, you have a new U.S. administration that is trying to, as Mr. Bütikofer said, forge a partnership with Europe, a united front, so to say, on the economic problems or economic issues created by the Chinese government. How would you imagine the Chinese leadership to feel looking at the current situation with G7, with Biden, with an EU that is sort of considering what to do?
Well, firstly, thank you, Politico, for having me here, Stuart. Very nice to see you again. How do the Beijing sees the world? I mean, two words, perhaps a balancing act that Beijing will have to play. On the one hand, we seem to hear all this rhetoric talking about that China is going to rule the world and that China facing once in a century opportunity to rule the world. But on the other hand, I think much of the description, much of the policy document came out from Beijing for the official documents. The second half, it is about that China facing unprecedented challenge, which have not seen in the last century. So I think that from Beijing's point of view, that it realized the geopolitical headwinds one way or another were really getting its head, and will become increasingly difficult that China to be able to forging certain international initiative that China has proposed. So I think the difficulties is there. Now, instead, what Beijing has done in the past 12 months or so, not just to combating the pandemic, but also try to somehow change its economic strategy to go forward, no longer just triggered by the GDP growth on the one hand, but also on the other hand, this whole ideas of so-called dual circulation, by putting strong emphasis towards domestic production and domestic consumption, and that's building a resilient supply chain within the country rather than outside China. So the layer of internal circulation, it is very much about asking the Chinese state capital, state companies to redistribute its economic resources from overseas and back to home. So you perhaps will see far less that the Chinese investment made in Europe, far less Chinese investment made in Latin America. And what are you expect to see is you're going to expect to see that Beijing's own version of pivot to Asia. So back to a so-called periphery diplomacy that puts strong emphasis on the Asia Pacific, and firstly to secure supply chain, and secondly to make sure strengthen the existing trade and economic ties with the Asian partner that is close to home. So I think it's also Beijing's version of economic survival guide.
Yes, indeed. And we'll stick to you for a moment, Dr. Yu, because here we're addressing a European audience, and a question that constantly comes up in my discussion here in Brussels is that a lot of people are really surprised by the level of counter-reactions on the sanctions imposed by Beijing after the European Union imposed sanctions on human rights regarding Xinjiang. And of course, Xinjiang and issues like Hong Kong and Taiwan, they do matter a lot to the Chinese leadership's consideration. So maybe you could explain to our audience why we were seeing the level of countermeasures from Beijing's side.
The countermeasures and various, this entire strings of debates we have in here is lamentable. Where we are today on the relationship between China and European Union. But on the other hand, we got to remember this is the party which really founded on the basis of the so-called territorial integrity. And somehow the Chinese population expect the government to behave in a certain way towards the foreign countries, towards the foreign powers, and when they do the finger pointing. So I think firstly, it's a natural response from the Chinese Communist Party, but secondly, it is also that domestic public opinion that matters, and that much of the Chinese population expect this leader to behave in a certain way when they come to foreign interventions on the so-called domestic affairs.
Thank you. And
can I dispute that?
Yes, please, Mr. Bütikofer, go ahead.
Look, I subscribe 100% to the principle of territorial integrity. I've never even worked with Uyghur organizations that might want to question that. But the issue at stake in Xinjiang, the issue at stake in Inner Mongolia, or in Hong Kong, or in Tibet, or in other places, even among the Han majority, is not about integrity of the territory. It's about civic and human rights. The persecution that China has imposed on Xinjiang does not just target people who advocate independence. I'm not even sure how many people there would be that would be in favor of East Turkestan independence, as some of them say. They are targeting people that express their Muslim faith. They are targeting people that have relatives living overseas. So this is an anti-democratic, anti-minority, repressive system that has nothing to do with territorial integrity. That's just a nationalist sort of cover-up.
And following from this discussion, Mr. Winkler, it seems more and more difficult to sort of talk about human rights and trade separately. At least, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman, when he was answering a question about the latest EU-China development just a short while ago, he said, the EU seems to be, having the cake and eat it. How dare them talk about, trade, but also trying to, lecture us on human rights. How should the EU approach this, apparent dilemma when it comes to China?
Mr. Lai, first, before responding to this direct question, I would like also to stay a little bit at the previous dispute, because I think that Dr. Yu has expressed something which is very obvious for us in the European Union, namely, if elections are important in Europe, then why should not we understand that elections are also important in China? So if we see now that the entire short-term future of the European Union is really determined, and the position in many questions of the European Union as a whole is determined by two elections, one in Germany in a few months' time and one in France in less than a year, or a little bit more than half a year, then also we should surely understand the fact that the elections in China, the Party Congress upcoming next year, even if it's not about the first position, but it's about many, I would say, hundreds of thousands of positions in the party at local levels, at the smallest levels, which are positions of power. So, of course, as elections determine standings and positions in the European Union, in the member states of the EU. So I think that it's very clear that the inner atmosphere, the internal atmosphere of China today, and starting from now up until next September or next October, will be greatly determined by this electoral process they are going through. Now, coming to your question, I think it's very clear that since a few years ago, since the European Union, or we in the European Parliament, are speaking about the so-called next generation free trade agreements, or the new generation free trade agreements, those are the agreements that include also TSD chapters. So trade and sustainable development comes to be more and more important in the views of the European Parliament, but also in the approach of the European Commission, naturally, because we are, as a Parliament, supervising the Commission and working together with them. And just remember, back in 2015, when the previous trade strategy was published, the Trade for All strategy, it was very clear that the European Union goes towards a fairer trade, a fairer globalization, and more attention towards climate situation, towards human rights, towards all the issues, all the aspects that can make a fairer and more sustainable trade. We were a lot discussing supply chains, due diligence. You know that we have an upcoming due diligence regulation. The proposal has to come any day now from the European Commission. So I think that what we are doing is not unexpected. What we are doing in the International Trade Committee and in the Parliament is fully predictable. We are coming with coherence to bring arguments about sustainability, about human rights, about the need to eliminate some basic wrongs. Because if I speak about forced labor, for example, I think it doesn't matter. You are communist or you are a democratic country, you are a free market economy. Forced labor is equally not understandable and not acceptable. So you might be a communist system or a communist country, but forced labor has no place in your society, as it does not have place in any society on the earth. Of course, we are very far from arriving to that point, but I think that we are making better and better points, and more important, we are building better and better alliances globally, because we are not alone. The European Union is not alone, is building alliances. So I think that what we need is the occasion or the framework to discuss, to maintain the dialogue, to explain our expectations, and also to build up the systems of gradual, progressive cooperation, because nothing can be achieved from one day to the another. So I think that perseverance and patience is what we need. Of course, it is not easy, I know. We need a rules-based system. My colleague, Mr. Bütikofer, just made the case that China does not want to enter in a rules-based system or in any of the rules-based system. I would say that, maybe it's not entirely so. We just had, after long years of negotiation, a geographic indications agreement with China. And what I think is that we need is to insist and to find the proper ways and the best moment to also continue our dialogue on the investment agreement when the conditions will be fulfilled for such a continuation.
And Dr. Yu, do you agree to that? Do you think China is moving towards being a rules-based sort of country or international order? Are they subscribing to it?
Well, I think there's a different multifaceted elements in here. And firstly, if we are talking about rules-based international order, and obviously I'm not speaking on behalf of the Chinese government, I'm just reflecting on what the Chinese leader thinking regarding on the rules-based. And they would always argue that because the rule-based international order was established back in 1945 and therefore no longer really suitable for the modern world, for the 21st century world. So I think China's approach in here is almost like that sense of a la carte approach, and to choose some elements of the so-called rules-based international order to follow, but some other elements of the rules-based international order to against. So I mean, just give you an example. When it comes to climate change and international economic governance, and China is actually a very keen follower for the so-called rule-based international order and fit into the so-called Washington consensus-based institutions. But then on the other hand, if you look into the issues on South China Sea, on human rights, on cybersecurity, and China's a total outlier. So again, because of that combination of that different identity and different political system, and that put China in a I would call it really a hybrid sense of the following the international order or not, and choose or not. So it's a quite complex picture, and it's very hard just to give a firm conclusion by saying that China is totally against the so-called rule-based international order, which China did back to 1960 and 1970 during the time of Cultural Revolution. But the consequences, as we have all seen, it was rather disastrous. So I think perhaps the Chinese Communist Party have learned a very hard lesson just by totally overthrowing the international order. Doesn't really make sense in nowadays world.
Thank you. And I'd like to move on to the role played by Germany in shaping the EU-China relations. As Mr. Winkler said, Germany is going to have a parliamentary election in September. And of course, Mr. Bütikofer comes from the Green Party, which is taking a much stronger, tougher line on China compared to the ruling CDU, for example. So Mr. Bütikofer, why don't you talk a little bit about the German election and its implication on EU-China relations? Do you foresee, for example, a role played by the Green Party in the next government? Is that going to change the overall direction on EU-China relations?
Well, it's hard to make a prediction, Yogi Berra told us, particularly when it pertains to the future. I don't know whether we will be in government, but what I see is a general shift of direction in Germany's China policy. You can see that when you look at the development of public opinion. You can see that when you look at debates within different political parties. So yes, the chancellor is probably China's best friend among European leaders, but within her own party, there are quite a few that would have a stance much closer to the one that I take. And you also see an interesting development in the business community. 2.5 years ago, it was the German Federation of Industry, BDI, that first came up with a China strategy that was very critical of the trajectory we've been on. And that has been echoed by Business Europe since. It's been echoed by other industrial associations, and talking to companies that are invested in China, you see a new realization that this is not just a bonanza for great business, that there are strategic issues at stake. Certainly, that development is still contentious. There are some voices, in particular from the chancellor and people who would adhere to her line, including her possible successor, Mr. Armin Laschet, who don't really see the need to look more closely at the systemic rivalry dimension. But then you also have a shift in a broad sense, and I would predict that regardless of who builds the next German government, the German position towards China will be more critical and it will be more European. Because in the past, Germany played an outlier role. The German relationship with China was much more intense than anybody else's. And at times, Germany has stood in the way of a coherent European position. But there are economic and political reasons for Germany to play along with European partners more strongly than we have in the past.
Thank you, Mr. Bütikofer. And if we stick to some country-specific issues, I mean, Mr. Winkler, you come from Romania, and Romania, of course, is one of the EU countries that is also part of the 17+1, now 16+1, after Lithuanians decided to quit it. So give us a sense of what the 17+1, the 16+1 means to the European countries involved, especially the EU countries in the club. Do you think it's going to make them think twice, or given the current EU-China situation, or is everything still business as usual?
Well, I wonder what exactly means business as usual, because it was a little bit more politics than business if I look back to the last 9 years of this cooperation. Of course, if you remember the beginnings, there was much optimism. There were lots of memorandums of understanding signed with various countries and so on, huge projects. But then gradually, year by year, the Eastern European countries also understood the fact that some of those projects come with a cost. And this is a political cost which you want or refuse to sign off to. Of course, it is a little bit complicated. It depends a lot also on the political orientation of the given government of the country. Just look to my country, to Romania, which has made a U-turn since the government is not left-wing anymore. The social democratic governments between 2012 and 2019 have been keen on cooperating and signing memorandums of understanding. Now we have a center-right government, and it is even Romania among the countries which did not participate in this spring at the highest level at the 2021 meeting of the, then it was still 17 plus 1. So it is a changing dynamics, but of course at EU level also I think that maybe more efforts are needed in incorporating the possible 17, 16 or whatever plus 1 cooperation. I mean, those countries in the Eastern Europe, inside the European Union, but also the countries in the neighborhood of the EU, have to have a palpable feeling of equality with the others. So we have also to give the sense of the Eastern European governments that they are forging equally with the Western European governments the China policy of the European Union. That I think is very important. So it is not only about dialogue between the European Union and China, but it is also about dialogue inside the European Union. And as you know very well, foreign policy is one really contested field. What will be the future of the EU foreign policy? As we are discussing now the future of the European Union, we have this conference on the future of Europe. One of the hot topics is also the future of decision-making in the European Union. And as we could see at the latest European summit, indeed, there are questions which are the so-called hot topics. The hotter one topic is, the more difficult that is for the European Union to speak with one voice, because it's the more difficult to make the compromise on which is that one European position that should be expressed and followed by everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Winkler. And time is running out. Why don't we also talk a little bit about the situation with regard to the Taiwan Strait? I mean, of course, we've seen a lot of tension going up between the Chinese mainland and Taiwan in terms of military planes, and also, you know, the US and the G7, actually, the G7 summit communique also mentioning the situation in Taiwan. So, Mr. Bütikofer, what should the European Parliament do and talk about and focus on with regard to Taiwan? Some people talk about, you know, having an investment deal, but of course Beijing wouldn't like the idea. What do you think should be the way forward?
I think it is indeed necessary to support Taiwan's democracy and to stabilize the status quo. That's why, indeed, across the board, there is a great consensus between most political groups in the European Parliament, including Mr. Winkler's group and my group, that the EU should indeed pursue an investment deal with with Taiwan. That should not be made a hostage of the CAI. Taiwan is its own WTO member. We have every right to strike such a deal with them. And we are trying to put pressure on Commission to reverse its stance, because Commission in trade policy paper 6 years ago promised that this would be on the agenda, and it has withdrawn from that position in the trade policy review. We don't really like that step. But I would not be so narrow as to only look at the economic relationship. We also do advocate, and this has been voted several times by the European Parliament, we do advocate stronger inclusion, meaningful inclusion of Taiwan in the work of a number of multilateral organizations like the WHO, the World Health Organization. There's no way for Taiwan to become a member, but they could be meaningfully engaged with the work of WHO, and they have something to bring to the table if you look at how they managed the pandemic. So I think that's a second element. And then there are also other elements, including more cultural, scientific, and political exchanges, because we want to signal to Beijing clearly we're not in favor of anything that would amount to an independence strategy. We're conservative. We want to have the status quo, but we also want to let Beijing understand that we're completely opposed to any unilateral action offsetting the Taiwanese democracy and any step towards military actions should be discouraged by signaling that this would not be taken just as a normal step, that we're engaged, we have a stake there. That's what we try to say.
Right. Now we have a few questions from the audience. So I think this one would be maybe interesting to Dr. Yu to comment on. Let me summarize it this way. It's about, what could be the way in which, because, the EU talks about, not just systemic rivalry and competition, but also cooperation. So what would be the kind of areas that China would be keen to engage the EU with regard to cooperation? And I think, to broaden this discussion a little bit, do you think China is still interested in cooperation with the EU now that we have seen, worsening ties between the two blocs, China and the EU? Or do you think, China is also becoming more awake to the kind of rhetoric that is shaping up in Europe?
Thank you. I think what we have now in here for this world is not just about the decoupling between China and the United States, but actually a decoupling between economic spheres and political sphere. You see, on the one hand, that seems to be that China getting even closer economically with many trading partners, but then on the other hand, become more politically polarized on different ends. So that's the scenario where I have now. I think China, by all means, even if talking about what I said earlier, the dual circulation, interested in consumption-driven economy, but China, nevertheless, is still very much an export-oriented power and still very much seeking for further economic opportunities. I mean, ultimately, that's the one way to judge that the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. So that won't change. Now, secondly, if we are talking about areas of possible cooperation, I mean, apart from the obvious one on climate change, things on the reform of the WTO that both EU and China has interested in shaping the world trading system. So I think that's an element. And maybe the third element for possible cooperation would be in outer space. I mean, think about that. China is also now emerging space power. And sooner or later, when the International Space Station decommissioned and when China remained to have an international space station. So that perhaps really EU and China could work together on certain areas and just to think outside of the box rather than just a traditional climate change sphere. But another thing which in here I think EU would be interested in is to really harmonize the trade standard in the Asia Pacific. I mean, for example, China is also talking about its interest in joining the so-called CPTPP. But again, that's much high standard trade bloc. In order to fulfill that criteria, and there's so much in terms of economic system that China has to change. So perhaps, again, that would be EU and China could work together to harmonizing on certain trade standards.
Well, thank you very much indeed. And on that note, thank you so much all for joining our session on EU-China relations in Political Competitive Europe Summit. And we'll take a short break from here. And after the break, we'll be having our next session, which will touch upon due diligence and dive deep into the European Commission's plan to establish new practices in European supply chains, which we also talked about briefly. But in the next session, we'll be having our colleague Sarah and Arab moderating this session and really look into the details and the politics about due diligence. But until then, have a good break and see you soon.